My guest is Dr. Marina Weiler, a neuroscientist and assistant professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral science at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, also known as DOPS. DOPS is one of the few academic research units in the world dedicated to exploring questions at the very frontier of science and spirituality. Questions like, what happens when we die? Does consciousness exist beyond the brain? And how do we rigorously study phenomena often dismissed as paranormal? With her background in medical science and neuroscience, Dr. Weiler brings both a skeptical eye and an open mind to her work. Together, we'll explore how DOPS approaches a scientific study of near-death and out-of-body experiences, the survival of consciousness after death, and even reports of cases of reincarnation. This is a conversation that pushes us to the edge of what we know and what we think we know about mind, memory, and the mysteries of being human. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Marina, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. I've had a little bit of a Monroe podcast marathon, I think, going on recently. I've talked about it so much. I've talked to people that focus on lucid dreaming. I've talked to people at the Monroe Institute around the technology. And now I'll be speaking with yourself. You are the assistant professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral science at the University of Virginia. And you're working right now at DOPS, which is also considered the Division of Perceptual Studies. So thank you so much. Before we get into all of this, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Chrissy, for the invitation.
You're welcome. So what is DOPS? I actually didn't really know a lot about DOPS until I had a good friend of mine, Anthony, who has a podcast as well, and in this space and talks a lot about consciousness. Well, he was driving me up to the Monroe Institute and he was speaking about DOPS and the people that he knows that works there and the amazing work that you're doing. And I've heard about it from Leslie Kean and I've heard about it in different documentaries, but I didn't know a lot about it until really I was driving myself up to a consciousness retreat. So for others, can you explain the work that DOPS does?
Yes. So DOPS, or the Division of Perceptual Studies, as you mentioned, we've been around since 1967, and it was founded by a psychiatrist called Dr. Ian Stevenson. And Dr. Ian Stevenson, in the early 60s, he started seeing a lot of cases of children who had memories of what could be seen of past lives, so alleged past life memories, and these kids were bringing these memories spontaneously. And Dr. Stevenson, at the time, he had to step down his appointment as the chief of the department to dedicate himself fully to the investigation of these cases of reincarnation type. And he traveled around the world and he documented many cases since it's been 60 years now. And right now we have a database of around 2,500 cases of the cases of reincarnation type.
That's unbelievable. So the things that you focus on at DOPS is life after death would be one of them. Correct me if I'm wrong, out-of-body experiences and reincarnation. When so many people within the materialistic science community would be like, this isn't possible. There's no real evidence of this. It's just testimony. So how do we put this into a framework that fits within the science community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I agree with you. Like I would say that many scientists, they would say studying life after death is pseudoscience. There is no scientific studies. It's not validated. It's not accepted within the scientific community. And that is not true. And that's a misunderstanding and a misconception that people think that we are doing religious studies or what we are doing cannot be validated scientifically. As you mentioned, at DOPS, we study many phenomena that defy the physicalism paradigm, which assumes that consciousness or the mind is produced by the brain. And the type of phenomena that I'm referring here is, as you mentioned, the kids that have alleged memories of past lives, out of body experiences, telepathy, remote viewing, psychic abilities, near death experiences, after death communication. So these are all of these phenomena, they provide evidence that not only the brain not only consciousness or the mind is not produced by the brain, but also that it can exist after brain death. So they're not only independent, but mind can survive brain death.
It's so unbelievable. Like I know people listening to this podcast and watching it are like some of them would be like, I'm not surprised. And others I think are like, what? All I'm seeing is like a mind blow emoji going off right now in my own mind. What is the empirical evidence then that you would say really shows that there is life after death outside of out of body experiences, but there is life after death and there is reincarnation? What do we see? We see testimony, but what else can we use as empirical evidence?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we can use testimonies. So for the cases of reincarnation type, we have 60 years of research started by Ian Stevenson and then followed by Dr. Jim Tucker, our past research director. And now we have two other researchers, Dr. Marietta Pelivanova and Dr. Philip Cozzolino, who are currently investigating the cases of reincarnation type. And as I mentioned, we have a huge database of these cases. They've been deeply studied and many times validated by the researchers. Research that Ian Stevenson started in the 60s, he documented all these cases. Like what types of memories are these kids bringing? Is there any chance that these kids are bringing these memories from a sensory leakage because they heard their parents talking about this? Is this like a related family member? Is it someone that the family used to know? Is like any normal means that the kid could be bringing that information, or maybe there is something beyond that? And Dr. Jim Tucker developed a scale to measure the strength of the cases. And depending on what type of information can be recovered from these claims, the cases are going to be stronger. So it measures, for example, what kind of behaviors the kid has, any type of related phobias that the parents cannot explain the current life. Does the child speak a foreign language that the parents cannot explain? It was never taught to the kid. There are some cases documented, and they're known as xenoglossy. Dr. Philip Cozzolino is doing research on that. Is there any birth defects that match the previous wound of the previous personality? And in many cases, the claims can be validated because the kids, they provide so much detailed information about first names, last names, addresses, that the researcher can track back to the previous personality and validate if those claims were actually accurate, and contact the family and see if those claims match what the kid is describing.
It's
So
unbelievable.
that would be a result. That's what we call the resolved case.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And there's so many things pointing to that. Yes, like that this is actually happening. You know, every single day I'm writing about something in science or technology, about brain computer interfaces, which is really interesting, of these intersections now where, we have Elon Musk trying to trademark the word telepathy, right? When we're hearing now that telepathy is something that people are able to do, and it's not related to working with a BCI or a brain computer interface, for people that don't know the acronym of BCI. But I find it so interesting that the mainstream, for so long, when this research has been done for 60 years, is still really, really quiet. We're seeing that it's obviously getting better, and this research is trickling out. But why has it been so slow in your perspective? Is it because the science communities are pushing back? But there's so many people within the science community that would be pushing back on that and saying that no, we need this information to get out. So why do you think the media has been so slow to pick this up, and why the science community, I guess, has won in context of materialistic science and has been able to really push this topic down so that people don't know and that this is actually a possibility?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think many scientists they push down our results, and I would say that not only they push down, like many scientists don't even want to look at it because they think it cannot exist. So I don't even want to look at the data. I don't even want to look at the evidence because it just cannot exist because it doesn't fit into our current mainstream paradigm, which is physicalist. So if you cannot explain through our current model, our current philosophical model, then it cannot exist. And I think the reason why it happens, there are so many different reasons for that. One is because obviously it hurts it hurts people's career. Many scientists, many mainstream scientists, they built their entire career into developing models of consciousness, so trying to explain how the brain produces consciousness. And obviously, they don't want to look at an alternative and thinking maybe the brain doesn't produce consciousness. Consciousness is primary and brain is just a filter. So that's one way of looking at it. And I think the other way of looking at it is that having a new philosophical framework, having a new cosmology or a new ontology in someone's life, it's something that requires a lot of cognitive accommodation. It's not something that you just read about the evidence and overnight you're like, oh, I believe there's an afterlife. This is the evidence, and now everything changes to me. This is a process. And even to me, I can say personally, I've been a mainstream physicalist, very radical physicalist, scientist. And to me, it took several years reading the evidence and reading books and reading papers and doing a deep research to finally accept that maybe the physicalism philosophical framework doesn't account for all the evidence that we are seeing, doesn't account for all the phenomena that we are studying. So as I mentioned, it's a process and it requires a lot of cognitive accommodation and requires a lot of like your beliefs, like how you face life, how you live your life, your behaviors, like your entire understanding of existence is based on your beliefs about an afterlife or the nature of reality. And it's a process and it requires a long time to finally change that.
It does. Sometimes I find myself thinking about consciousness or thinking about life after death, and there, I have this element of me, which is probably then the ego, I would say, that's pushing it out, that's saying no, that can't be possible. And then I'm always kind of battling with myself in my own head, the stats, the facts, the evidence, and saying, is this real? So I think there is this element that we don't want to believe it. And I do say that there is this epidemic that's going on, I feel, within humanity, is that we don't believe each other and we don't have a form of belief, right? And this is outside of any type of religious or dogma kind of belief. But it's just more that we don't believe each other or we don't believe witnesses. And so I find myself in that position sometimes fighting that duality consistently, and having to step into both those worlds, trying to keep my feet maybe grounded and then also find myself kind of up somewhere else in my consciousness.
Yeah, and that's a healthy thing, right? Everyone should be like that. Like even the researchers that work at jobs, we don't take everything for granted. Oh yes, it's obviously this is happening, and I'm not even gonna investigate the cases. It doesn't work like that. So we do robust investigation, but we are also open-minded. And I think that's the attitude that every scientist should have. And I think that's exactly what you were telling me about yourself. So we do ask ourselves, is this worth investigation? Is this a good enough evidence? Is this good enough data? What is the data telling me? So we are constantly asking ourselves those same type of questions. We don't take everything, oh yes, that is true. And So that's a healthy exercise, is to be grounded, keep your feet on the ground, and analyze deeply throughoutly all of the data, all of the evidence, but at the same time being open-minded and like, okay, if this is it good enough data, and if my current paradigm cannot explain this, then I need to replace it by a different paradigm. So it's a balance, and it's really hard to find that balance. And just like you, sometimes I also ask myself, is there really an afterlife? Can this really happen? So for example, like an out of experiencer saw something, or had a perception, or a person had a near-death experience and saw something happening in the surgery room, or this amazing case of a kid who had this past life memories, and it's validated, and the kid is bringing so many details about the previous personality. And I also asking myself, is this true? Can this really be? Because we also have the skeptic mind, and by skeptic I don't mean denier. It's just being skeptic, just means like a healthy doubt.
Yes.
That is the exercise that we are all aiming, is to have like a healthy doubt and be skeptic, but at the same time open-minded to what the data is telling you.
Yes, exactly. And be able to look at the data from different perspectives too. As science is evolving and the understanding of consciousness is growing and we're getting more tools to be able to measure these experiences, we can analyze it in different ways. And for me, that really is a case too when I'm speaking to people like yourself and other professors and academics in this space, because my job is to be able to report these things to the general public and make sure that it is as factual as possible, right? And is backed by different evidence and multiple people with different sources, maybe reporting these things or coming to the same ideas. We have papers that are peer reported. Like all of this is so important. And the fact that the mainstream community or some other scientists just poo poo over it, like it kind of drives me crazy a little bit. And there are other communities, though. We look at Robert Bigelow, who was a billionaire that has Bigelow Aerospace, but he's also opened a Conscious Institute where he was doing research at one point. And I believe this is probably about 5 years ago. He put out an award for people showing the most I think in the most academic way or academic paper of the actuality of life after death. And I believe DOPS took part of that. And I'm not sure if you were there when that happened, but if you know anything a little bit about it, I'd love you to share that with us.
Yeah, that contest that you're talking about was launched in 2021, so 4 years ago. And the title of the contest is "What is the best evidence for an afterlife?" And they received over 1,000 total essays, and 203 were deemed worth of evaluation and judgment by the 6 judges. At the time, I won an award with other 2 colleagues, Rafael Casseb and Alexandre Caroli. We wrote about mediumship as the best evidence for an afterlife. At the time, I was not a DOPS yet. I joined DOPS in 2023, and this happened in 2021. And for our essay, we discussed a case of a famous medium that lived in Brazil and from 1910, and he passed away in 2002, so he lived to be 92 years old. And he produced a fabulous and fascinating legacy, around 500 books and thousands of letters, all attributed to deceased people. And we investigated his work, his legacy, some of his books, and some of his letters. And in the essay, we also provide what would be the possible alternative explanations to account for the phenomena, to account for the information that he's able to get from alleged deceased people. And we end up, after a very careful analysis, considering it could be telepathy or it could just be fraud or code reading, we end up with the conclusion that the only thing that explains his work would be the survival of consciousness.
Wow. It's just, and congratulations. That's
Thank you.
amazing. And I think that it's unbelievable that we see Robert Bigelow, who has been deeply interested in UAP, has moved into the consciousness space. And I know that is an outcome because of, I believe, his wife passed away, and that has affected him so much. And I know that he was so deeply interested in life after death. So I find it very fascinating that a man that's a billionaire has moved into this space and now has been pretty quiet, I believe, in the most recent years. But I think it's unbelievable that watched Robert Bigelow do that, because he was funding something that not all mainstream science will fund. And so I think that he's moving steps forward so that people are looking at this and saying, hey, this is an actual reality.
Yeah, there was a very interesting approach that he took. As you mentioned, he was really interested in the UAP, and he used to be the owner of the Skinwalker Ranch. So he did a lot of research into anomalous phenomena, cattle mutilation. And then, as you mentioned, when his wife passed away, and he also had a grandson that committed suicide. So he's been really interested lately in the consciousness topic, and that's why he launched the contest.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. When we have to look at, the function of the brain, and we're saying that this is, they're not mutually exclusive. They can work together. We have the brain that can be maybe a receptor. Let's just maybe call it an antenna, or it could be living in the brain, but it's also living potentially outside of us and around us. And are we downloading this consciousness, or are we tapping into it? But when we look specifically at the brain, where are the regions in the brain that might fire off when we look at things like out of body experiences or reincarnation, or even just, I wouldn't say maybe lucid dreaming we can put in there as well, but more, I would say, like life after death, out of body experiences. Is it the same regions that we see that the brain fires off, or do we see that it's kind of tapping into other regions when this is happening?
So we don't have one specific regions or set of regions that are firing off, as you mentioned, when these experiences are happening, like mystical or extraordinary experiences or experiences related to the afterlife. There is no such a thing in the brain. There are some regions implicated with spirituality. So the temporal regions of the brain. So, for example, patients that have temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a dysfunction of the temporal regions of the brain, one of the symptoms of this condition is hyper-religiosity or hyper-spirituality. So that is one way of looking at it. Out-of-body experiences, specifically, they might have another region of the brain firing, which is what is called the temporal parietal junction, which is located at the back. And it's a specific region that combines information coming from different parts of the brain. So it combines visual with spatial, with auditory stimuli. So it's what we call the secondary associative region. And there has been some studies that showing that the temporal parietal junction is involved in out-of-body experiences and in alterations of bodily consciousness. However, with limitations, because the studies showing the association between the temporal parietal junction and out-of-body experiences, they describe something a little different than what I consider an out-of-body experience. They describe more alterations in bodily consciousness, maybe seeing a second double or having the feeling that your legs are shrinking or enlarging, which is not a proper out-of-body experience. So as I said, with limitations. There are other regions, for example, the default mode network, which is considered a filter in the brain. And the default mode network is a combination of brain regions, which is the medial prefrontal cortex with the posterior cingulate cortex, the temporal parietal junctions at the back, and sometimes temporal regions that I mentioned in the beginning. And the default mode network is a functionally connected network that is active every time a person is engaged in self-referential thought. So when an individual is left undisturbed, for example, if you are driving your car, or if you are riding a bus, or if you are just left undisturbed, automatically your mind is going to go to that state of daydreaming or planning about your life, thinking about the past, thinking about past conversations, thinking about that meeting went, thinking about how am I going to reply to that email? What am I going to do after work? What am I going to tell my children after school? What am I going to? So, all this planning and thinking about autobiographical memory, that's the default mode network active. It's that little voice that we had inside our minds, the narrative. That's what we call the narrative ego. That's the default mode network. And when we engage in external tasks, for example, now that I'm talking to you, if I'm paying attention to what you're saying, or I have to think about my answers, or I'm reading a text, or I'm paying attention into a movie, or I'm solving a puzzle, or learning a new language, anything that requires my cognition, my cognition to be external to my own thoughts, we have to deactivate the default mode network. And the default mode network is considered a filter because during meditation practices and psychedelic experiences, the default mode network quiets down. So meditation is pretty much quieting down your mind and not being engaged into self-referential thought. You need to focus into something external, either your breathing or what's happening, focusing on a bird singing outside or in a mantra. So you need to focus on anything that is not your own thoughts and planning and that narrative voice inside our minds. So that's what meditation does. And there are also being research showing that psychedelics, they also quiet the default mode network. And when we quiet our default mode network, that's when we have access to this broader awareness system, to this larger consciousness system. And then maybe we can tap into information and have psychic experiences and mystical experiences. So, but again, there is not one specific brain region. There is no such thing as the God region of the brain. Some researchers think the pineal gland is involved with mediumship and psychic experience. I think that hasn't been good data to show that yet. That some people think that there are crystals inside the pineal gland, and that's what mediums are able to tap into information and talk to deceased people. But again, I think that lacks scientific evidence for that. And I would say the neural filters of the brain, the default mode network is a very important set of brain regions that in mystical experiences and even psychic phenomena.
I know when we first met, after I came back from the Monroe Institute, I spoke to you a little bit about my mother having Alzheimer's. And we spoke about these default networks. And for her, those default networks right now, as the disease is progressing and she's in her last stage 4 of the disease, is obviously shut down in many ways. So I find her when I'm with her, every other week, I find her sometimes in maybe different altered states of mind, or, her seeing things that she thinks she's seeing or saying. And she's somewhat verbal / nonverbal, and it's hard to make out. Sometimes it's gibberish. Sometimes it's, full words like the swear word, which people that have Alzheimer's and people know that this is very normal for them to be consistently swearing. And for some reason, they don't forget those things, which is probably there's many reasons why, but in that area of the brain, they don't. But I would find that one moment she did say something to me, and I remember explaining this to you. She said to me, when I walked in and I was feeding her lunch, she knew I'm working on this project right now, and she knew the person's name I was working with. And she's never met this person in her life. I've never spoke about this person ever to her. No one in my family has ever mentioned it to her. And while I was feeding her, she said his name to me. And then she asked me after, a lot of gibberish, what's he like? And I instantly called, my best friend Marie and said, like, or texted her and said, I need to text this so I have, evidence and this is logged that this happened. And then I called my sister and my dad instantly and was like, did you say, does mom know I'm working on this project? Did you somehow talk about it with her? And they said no. And my sister Adele made a joke saying, well, maybe mom's psychic now. And a part of me, laughed, but then I also went, no, that is telepathy. So there's something that we're seeing. And I know Kai Dickinson's from the telepathy tapes has been looking into this. And she has an episode on her podcast about Alzheimer's and telepathy. What a wonderful way if we're able to do this to connect to people that have this disorder and this disease that they're, never going to be able to, hopefully one day there is a cure, but if not right now, that we are able to communicate with them through their last days. Have you seen any evidence or anything when it comes to Alzheimer's? Because I know that you have previously worked in Alzheimer's research that shows that this might actually be a possibility, or there might be research in the future to come that will show that.
Yeah, I remember you told that story. It's so fascinating, and I think it's really interesting because, as you mentioned, I did many years of my research were dedicated into understanding Alzheimer's disease, and one of the things that happens in a person with Alzheimer's disease in their brains is that the default mode network is not functional anymore. And it's interesting because Alzheimer's disease, it's a combination of pathologies. It's the tau pathology plus the beta amyloid. And those specific pathological proteins, they accumulate in some regions of the brain that overlap with the default mode network. So right in the beginning, at early stages of Alzheimer's disease, we see dysfunctions in the default mode network. They either cannot deactivate the default mode anymore and engage in external tasks. That's usually one of the main things. So we see structural issues in their brains, especially in overlapping regions of the default mode network, but also functional regions where they cannot deactivate the default mode anymore and activate it properly. So both ways. So they cannot engage in external tasks like they used to do anymore. And it seems that they cannot engage into self-referential thoughts in a functional way either. So none of them is happening properly. Either self-referential thought and processing of autobiographical memory, which is the DMN activated, but also the deactivation of the DMN and engaging into external tasks. So none of them are working properly. And that's why they have issues engaging in cognitive tasks, but also that's why they have issues into remembering their past lives and planning for the future and navigating, and their narrative selves are now dysfunctional. So they lose their identity, they lose their memories. And again, this is the default mode network. And maybe it could be one of the reasons why we see instances and episodes of telepathy, just like you mentioned. I'm not aware of any specific studies investigating telepathy or psychic abilities in Alzheimer's disease, but I think it could pretty much happen because of the neural filters. And not only Alzheimer's disease, but other conditions that we know that the DMN, the default mode network, is dysfunctional, such as autism spectrum disorder.
I know with Kai Dickinson, we've seen with autism, yeah, and the work that she's doing with one of the other researchers, that it's unbelievable the amount of telepathy that we're seeing with kids that are nonverbal autistic. And that's something that I will at one point cover in this podcast and speak with their team about it, because it's living with a mom that has Alzheimer's and seeing that this is something that is possible and we're seeing in all different spectrums when it comes to neurology, it's fascinating. It really is. I I wonder when it looks at the collaborating, when you're collaborating with, different types of soft sciences and hard sciences, how do you collaborate, let's say, with something within the work that you're doing when it comes to like philosophy, psychology, theology, when we're looking at the question of life beyond death? How does DOPS take all of those other soft sciences into context and to your own research?
Yeah, so DOPS itself is a group of researchers, is a multidisciplinary group of researchers. So we have psychiatrists in our team, we have psychologists, we have statistician and experimental psychologist. I'm a neuroscientist. So it's a multidisciplinary team, and I think this is really important because when we are talking about the afterlife and a new philosophical framework, we do need different inputs and people with different backgrounds. I don't think it would be enough, and we wouldn't do a good job if we only have psychiatrists or if we only have philosophers. Like, we need this wider viewpoint to add to make a cohesive picture of the afterlife. And I specifically collaborate with philosophers. I collaborate with other neuroscientists. I collaborate with psychologists, with psychiatry. So depending on which project specifically I'm working on. So I have projects studying sense of embodiment with a neurologist. I have another project investigating entity encounters with philosophers and also an anthropologist, like the person leading the project is an anthropologist. So I have my other out-of-body experiences projects that I'm collaborating with psychologists. So it depends. It depends specifically on the project, but we do need that specific, not that specific, but that broad multidisciplinary team, so we can have a full picture of what is happening in the brain when a child is bringing memories of a past life, what is happening in the brain when a person is having out-of-body experiences. So about near-death experiences, we need cardiologists, we need doctors saying, yes, there was a brain death or a cardiac arrest when this specific thing happened. We need the psychiatrist doing the evaluation, or maybe helping us distinguish this is more related to disorders and schizophrenia, or these are healthy instances. We need psychologists understanding the impact of these experiences. So this is how we collaborate.
Yeah, it makes sense that you have to, right? Not everybody, it's an area of study. Not everybody can know one thing. So you have to work together. And what's such a wonderful scientific community to be looking at different types of phenomenon and questions that, what does it mean to be alive? And what does it mean potentially if we do go life after death, which I believe we do now.
And now I just remember we are now also starting to collaborate with physicists, especially theoretical physicists, because quantum physics and is just raising. We're just talking a lot about new theories of consciousness, and some of them involve quantum physics. So theoretical physicists, they are also giving their input and helping us bring together a new philosophical framework.
There was a study that you said you were doing about entities. I'm curious to see if you're able to elaborate a little bit about that. And I believe you said you're working with a cultural anthropologist or an anthropologist on that study. Can you break it down and the type of research that you're doing around entities?
Yeah, it's a very interesting project that we are doing to investigate what types of entities people encounter during out-of-body experiences. And we are about to launch a survey. We already have IRB approval, and the survey is all prepared, and we are about to launch it. It's a set of questions, pretty much asking what types of entities have you encountered, anything from living people, but also deceased family members, deceased friends, or more spiritual beings, gurus, or Jesus, or gods, or angels, or diabolic entities, or orbs, or cartoons. Like all types of entities, like human or non-human entities. And we also want to evaluate what is the impact of that encounter and if the person received any specific message, what was the message, how was the communication between the person and the entity. So it's a very thorough study that we are about to launch. But I can give you some very preliminary data. I am currently doing some qualitative analysis using large language models in a data set that I have of over 1,000 OBE reports. And one of the themes that I'm investigating is entity encounter. And I'm doing this back and forth with AI, whatever AI can come up with, but also the sub themes that I can feed to the AI. And we came up with 4 sub themes. One is living people. The other one is deceased familiar members and friends. The other one would be spiritual entities, as I mentioned, like Jesus or Guru or gods or angels. And then the last one is non-human entities, including aliens. And it's been very interesting, like many people report, I don't recollect exactly the percentage of this, but around 30% of people report meeting entities in general. And 6% of them, I found in 6% of my reports, meeting with non-human entities, including aliens.
Wow.
But I would say that the most common report entity encounter is with deceased family members, and I find that in when I interview OBers, either people that have induced out-of-body experiences or people that have them spontaneously, they very commonly have after-death communication with deceased family members.
Now, when you're breaking this down, and this is just looking at it from a different perspective, is it because of the loss and the grief that these people might feel that they're having this, because they're meeting people from the other side that have passed, and being able to deal with this type of grief, that this is just in their mind?
It could be, but I don't think that's the main factor. And we have another survey that we're about to launch, and it's a collaboration with my colleague Kim Pemberthy. And we are investigating after death communication during out of body experiences. So people that meet with deceased family members or friends or even unfamiliar people during out of body experiences. And we are going to investigate the role of grief in those encounters. But to be honest, I don't think it's related to grief. For example, my participants, I've interviewed a lot of people that can induce these experiences at will, and they meet what they call spirit guides. And spirit guides, according to them, are deceased people who are helping them navigate this current life. So it has nothing to do with grief. They're just deceased people. They lived at a time, and right now they are spirit guides helping them, assisting them into this current life. So this is very commonly reported, meeting spirit guides, either spontaneous or induced out-of-body experiences. I also had another participant who we brought to the lab, and she was inducing out-of-body experiences. She could do this on demand. It was pretty remarkable. She has a very nice gift, and she could induce her OBs in just a few seconds. And every time she had an OBE, she met her deceased mother. But her deceased mother passed 10 hours prior. So she was not grieving, she was not in that state of suffering. But every time she met her deceased mother, it was just so emotional to her. She came back into tears, and every time she came back to our body, she was just crying and saying, I met my mom again, and my mom gave me another message, and my mom told me to such and such and such. So she was constantly in tears because every time she was meeting her mom.
Oh my gosh. Like, it's just, it's unbelievable. Like
Yeah,
when I hear
yeah.
these things again, my brain, one part of my brain is saying, wow. And then you're also hearing, the spirituality community around us is saying, well, we've been telling you this for so long,
Yeah.
right?
And
Which
another
some,
interesting thing
yeah,
that to me makes me believe it's not necessarily related to grief, this after-death communication during OBs, is that this group that I'm working in Brazil, that I've been working with them for the past 3 years, they they induce they teach people how to induce out-of-body experiences at will based on meditation and visualization techniques, and they master the technique. And just like this other participant, they can induce them after a few minutes. One of the main reasons that they learn how to induce OB is that they want to learn how to have out of body experiences, is to meet what they call earthbounds. So people that passed away and they're still trapped into this physical realm, either because they are having issues accepting their death, or because they've suffered too much and sometimes they don't even know they passed away and they're still lingering around. So they, with their OBEs, they can go into this spiritual realm, into this astral realm, and have connections with the spirit, with spirits and deceased people, and help them move along and pass to another realm. So it's what they call assistance.
wow. You know, out of all the work that you've been doing for so long in this area, and this is just a question we might not, you don't have to have a defined reason why, but from looking at it and just in your perspective and your opinion, why are we doing this? Like, why as humans, are we able to have these things that are out of body? Like, why are we here living in this, this simulation world or whatever the heck it may be? But we're able to then be able to connect, with deceased loved ones, and we really don't die, is from what we're hearing and what and work at stops is might be somewhat pointing to, when we have these abilities to do these things. But why? Do you ever sit there and wonder sometimes, like, why are we given this?
Yes, I do wonder that. And I think the reason why we are able to communicate with deceased people and go to different realms, or sometimes, like, why are these kids having memories of past lives? Why are we having all those mystical experiences? Why can we experience telepathy? And I think the reason for this is specifically to show that there is something else. This is consciousness wanting to show that there is something beyond the physical reality. There is something beyond our brains. There is something beyond what we experience in this 3D reality. And I think that is honestly just consciousness trying to show us, hey, there is something else here. This is the evidence. Here are the experiences. But we cannot live in that reality all the time, right? We need to live in this physical reality. We need to understand space and time, and we need to feel separated from each other. I need to understand that I'm a person and I'm in this physical body, and you, Chrissy, you are a different person in your physical body, and I'm separated from everyone else to be in this journey, to live my life and learn whatever lessons I need to learn in this physical reality. It it would be too overwhelming to just have to be in constant communication with deceased people, or being able to tap into everyone's mind all the time, or being able to experience interconnectedness all the time. We do need this feeling of separation and space and time and embodiment, so we can learn what the physical reality is bringing to us. But at the same time, we also have instances of, hey, this is not all there is. You see, sometimes you can tap into someone else's mind. Sometimes you can communicate with a deceased person. Sometimes you can have a glimpse of what death is about when you have a near death experience.
It's yeah, and that makes sense. It's true. And we have to be able to be present in this space, and maybe we are very fortunate and lucky that maybe there's there could be multiple races within the cosmos that could potentially like us, or maybe we're the only one that is able to live on this rock and, choose when to be able to separate between those realities. Uh, do you ever think that we are going to get to the point within our lifetime when people have accepted this? It has now embodied into the mainstream ideology and into belief systems that these things outside of religion, because a lot of religions do believe this, but outside of dogma, will we get to this point where even atheists and everyone else in the mainstream world will believe this, and it will be implemented into our daily lives and how we go about doing things, how we consume products? Do you think that we're going to be able to get there by the time, within our own lifetime?
Yeah, I sure hope so. That's the goal. And I think, to be honest, I do see a change in people's mind about about shifting the philosophical framework or the paradigm that we currently accept. It's it's a long process. We don't just change philosophical frameworks from day to night, and not even from one year to another, not even from 5 years. We need a lot of evidence. We need a lot of study. It's we have many gatekeepers preventing the information to be out there, and it's okay, it's healthy, like we can't just be changing paradigms all the time and accepting a new reality all the time. So there is something healthy about that. But at the same time, it is a long process, and we have the gatekeepers trying to not have the information out there, trying not to have papers published, trying not to accept a new reality. And I sure hope that this could happen within my lifetime. I mean, if I live to be 80 years old, we still have around 40 years, and I sure hope that this can happen within the next few decades.
Me too. I'm in the same time frame. So I really hope, reporting on this topic, and I think it's one of the most exciting things to be alive and watch the advancements of this, but being it embedded into the mainstream ideology and it then being practiced will be a wonderful time to be alive. And I hope that I get to see just even the beginning of it, if not be able to embody some of it. Not just saying now you can now, but meaning, within a mainstream ideology. Marina, thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me today. And please, as the work keeps going on in DOPS, please keep us informed, my listeners, my viewers informed, because as much as I love it, I know they do as well.
Thank you, Chrissy, so much for having me.